Well, hi there. This is probably one of the few times that I'm going to make a recording. It's also one of the few times that you are going to be getting a PowerPoint. But I wanted to talk with you a little bit about a model of trauma. The PowerPoint's mostly going to focus on the biological aspects of trauma. There will be some element also of the psychological effects of trauma. And your task for the week will be twofold. One is to take some decent notes. You will have the PowerPoint copy uploaded to Blackboard. But I want you to also focus on the environmental or social aspects of trauma, particularly once somebody has the disorder of PTSD. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that assignment at the end, but I wanted to tell you that before we launch into the PowerPoint itself. You will, of course, have to integrate the social and environmental effects or aspects of PTSD with its biological factors and psychological factors. So do pay attention to all of it, and hope you can take some good notes as well. So I'm going to share the screen. And take us to the handout, which is on the physiological toll of psychological trauma. The body's adaptation to trauma is pretty remarkable. And it allows us to call upon physiological and psychological resources to meet the demands of an emergency. It affects our health and homeostasis of multiple organ systems, pretty much all of the major organ systems, certainly our heart and lungs, as well as our brain, our endocrine systems, even our stomach. Because it is a trauma that is usually a sudden, potentially life-threatening situation, the resources that are called up are going to necessarily disrupt the normal self-regulation or homeostasis of all of these systems, including the homeostasis of the brain. We've also learned that the body's response to trauma can also produce inherited changes in our genetic profiles. The focus of the discussion and the PowerPoints is going to be start with our body's stress response. It's a pretty remarkable system, except that it's not designed for long-term or overwhelming stresses or trauma. And so the effects of that necessary adaptation are quite detrimental to our physiology and our psychology. And also, we'll talk a little bit about the ways of that our body responds to some of the physical changes that are trauma induced. So if you haven't seen this before, it's a pretty typical diagram of the body's stress response. One thing that's different about a diagnosis of PTSD, which is what we'll end up talking about towards the end, is it is the one and only psychological diagnosis that first begins with a outside stimulus. This particular system that we're talking about responds to stress, but it also responds to a trauma, which essentially overwhelms our stress system. But our typical stress response involves information that we experience, that we interpret as something that's dangerous, something that's potentially threatening. And what will happen is that our brain then charges up our endocrine system by first sending information to our pituitary gland, down to the spinal column, spinal nerves, to a gland at the top of our kidneys called the adrenal gland. A major stressor, such as maybe seeing an impending car accident or something awful about to happen, we will then secrete two major hormones. One is called cortisol, and the other is called adrenaline. You're probably well familiar with what adrenaline does to you. It gives you the shakes, but it also gives you a tremendous amount of energy and a great deal of muscle strength. So it's very helpful in this response, which we sometimes call the fight or flight response. Strong muscles, lots of energy, gives us the ability to run away as necessary or possibly fight as necessary. There are documented remarkable feats of strength that occur in response to stress, such as a mother being able to lift a small car like a Volkswagen off of one of her children if they are injured. Now, cortisol is something that you don't necessarily feel, but it's really a crucial aspect of our stress response. And its job is to allow us to rapidly release sugars that are stored in fatty acids. It very quickly converts, I won't give you the chemistry of it. You can look it up if you're interested, but it very quickly converts, like I said, sugars that are stored in fatty acids, quickly converts them back into sugar that goes into our bloodstream very quickly, and again gives us energy that is needed by the body to respond to an emergency. Now, this is a very similar drawing because, of course, the stress response is the stress response. It's very, very well documented. And in future classes, when you have to talk to me about the biopsychosocial aspects of other emotional difficulties, such as depression, anxiety, this will also involve this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So it's often called the HPA axis because it's a lot easier to say. Now, one of the reasons I have this particular drawing is I want to draw your attention to this little corner part of the drawing. This refers to gene activity. GR stands for glucocorticoid receptor. There are genes that affect the glucocorticoid receptors in our body. They are all throughout our body, by the way. And what we understand about the genes that activate and control our glucocorticoid receptors are genes that might get changed as a result of exposure to high levels of stress. That's one of the reasons I wanted to show you this particular diagram. The little blurb here at the side describes what this gene FKBP51, what it does. You can look at that if you want. It's not super important. The main thing I wanted you to get is that there's growing understanding of how genetic activity is responsible for, not genetic activity, let me rephrase that, gene activity, which either inhibits or enhances the building of proteins and maybe the breakdown of proteins in the body. These are controlled by genes and gene activities, and these genes in turn can change in response to chronic stress. This little guy here in the corner also, there says GR and MR. One of the things that the adrenal gland releases are not just glucocorticoids, but also hormones that help us to better utilize our minerals. So this stands for essentially mineral corticoid receptors, but that's not as crucial to the discussion as the glucocorticoid activities of the stress response. We back up. So this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, is responsible for what we normally think of as the fight-flight response. But we also forget when we use this term that there's also a possibility of a freeze or shutting down response. This usually occurs in overwhelming stress or trauma, and we can't always predict how we're going to react in an emergency. Sometimes we'll feel like we can mobilize our resources to take care of business, maybe put out a fire, or it's more of a fight response. Other times we may run. We might not even expect that we're going to run, but we will. And we might be just so utterly overwhelmed that we can't think of anything to do, and we will freeze. This is a really, really old response. It's very primitive. And many animals, most notably the opossum, will freeze under extreme stress. They will lay down and act as if they are dead. In fact, you can even poke them and they won't react. And it generally works pretty well. The animal that's attacking the opossum will usually walk away. It will lay there very still for a very long time and then get up and scramble away. If you are interested in watching a short video, it's an animation of the fight-flight response. There's a little link there, but it's not necessary. The bottom line is this stress response allows us to, as I've sort of given away in this other slide, it allows you to encounter a dangerous, potentially life-threatening, certainly frightening situation, and it allows you to live through that response, that situation, and perhaps even be able to tell a story about it. The difficulty occurs with people who are exposed to high levels of chronic stress or trauma. Our body is not designed to be in this emergency state for prolonged periods of time. I also want to be relatively clear about how I'm going to be defining trauma. There's a tendency now to refer to many things as traumas that are actually simply stressors. But a trauma is a good universal definition of trauma is it is a situation or stressor that, at the time at least, completely overwhelms our ability to cope. Something may be stressful, like you have a report that's due, or you've got some tension in your family, or you've got a boss that's kind of on your case about something. That's stress. Generally, we feel like we are able to, it's not fun, but you can manage it. A trauma might be something more like you're at work and all of a sudden there's a massive earthquake and the building collapses on you. Very few people would feel like that was simply a stressor and that you could sort of rally all of your resources and easily get out of the situation. Both regular stressors as well as overwhelming stressors or trauma, by their very nature, by the necessity of having the HPA axis suddenly activate, will destabilize the complex processes of homeostasis that go on in our body. The next slide I'm going to show you is one of the simpler homeostatic systems of the body. So I want to give you a sense that homeostasis is incredibly complex, often very subtle. And again, stress and trauma can overwhelm several systems of homeostasis in the body. So this is a pretty well-known system of homeostasis that's involved in controlling our body temperature. I say it's simple, but look at it, it's pretty darn complicated. We know the system well. It's one of the ones that differentiates the mammals from the reptiles. And in mammals, all of these sorts of things go together. And if you notice, this is color-coded so that there's known enzyme systems. There is a whole lot of other systems involved with blood factors like sodium and sugar and all sorts of things going on. And these are some of the reactions that occur in the body to re-regulate homeostasis. For instance, if someone is cooling too much, we will lower production of a whole bunch of these enzymes and blood factors, and we'll engage in shivering, which creates heat and re-regulates our temperature. If we're overheating, too hot, a whole bunch of other reactions will occur and feed back into some of these systems. Obviously, this is not a crucial thing for you to know, other than to understand that homeostasis is really complex. It involves numerous bodily systems. It involves enzymes, immunological functioning, digestion, heart functioning, lung functioning, and certainly brain functioning. And stress and trauma dysregulates pretty much every single homeostatic system in our body. And over time, this gets to be quite problematic. If we have to adapt to long-term stress, especially high levels of stress, and even short-term levels of trauma, which again overwhelm our ability to cope, these are some of the very well-known results. There are definitely effects to our brain and nervous system. It will even affect our skin. We will often get dry skin, eczema, acne, that sort of thing. That's not hugely problematic. It's just an index of how high our levels of stress are. Also, we may end up losing our hair, or even sometimes people will get a lot of white hair suddenly as a result of a trauma. It affects our muscles and joints. It will definitely affect our heart. It also affects our pulmonary or lung function. It most definitely affects our digestive tract, our stomach, our intestines, and our pancreas. In fact, high levels of stress and trauma are actually known to be a factor in diabetes. It also affects our reproductive system. Certainly, it is possible to have our women's menstrual cycle affected, as well as in men, lower sperm production, as well as reduced sexual desire for both men and women. And as I'll discuss later, it also affects our some of the genes that we then pass on through our reproductive tract. So I'm going to talk about these physiological effects in some detail, particularly focusing, of course, on the neurological, because that's the most important bit in terms of our behavior changes. Although oddly enough, our gastrointestinal system is also very important for our behavioral system. But we'll talk about all of these things in upcoming slides. So our gastrointestinal tract. When we experience a great deal of stress, we often will have cycles of either being constipated or having diarrhea. We can get ulcers, we can get inflammatory bowel diseases. But really, quite importantly, is new knowledge now that we have about basically the germs and other things that live in our stomach, which are various microbes. These microbes help us to digest our food. And we're finding out that they're absolutely necessary for healthy immune functioning, as well as healthy functioning of our brains and our psychology. We now know that when our intestinal microbiome, as they call it, are not working properly, we not only have stomach issues, but we also have changes in our mood, our behavior, our cognition, and something here called nociception, which refers to the perception of pain. Cardiovascular effects include high blood pressure, the inflammation of our arteries, various types of heart disease and heart attacks, Arrhythmias, that is the inaccurate or unequal rhythm of the heart, which actually places at risk for stroke in and of itself. But all of these other things, of course, greatly increase our risk of stroke, which is not something you ever want to have to experience. Here are some cardiovascular, or actually, it's a little bit of an extension of the cardiovascular effects, but I wanted to show you here. These are MRIs of people, probably the same person as it looks like, actually, under stressed versus unstressed conditions. So the unstressed person is here on the left, and the stressed person is here on the right. Now, when the person is highly stressed, you have increased activity in our heart. We also have increased activity in our bone marrow, because that's where we produce immunological cells, especially white blood cells. And we also have increased activity in something called the amygdala. And actually, I think I messed up this slide. I think the stressed person is actually on the left as opposed to on the right, because there ain't a whole lot of activity going on in the amygdala here on the right. At any rate, we do know that in addition to having a stressed out, inflamed heart, there's also a lot of other activity going on that's affecting our immunological functioning and our neurological functioning. And I'm still not convinced. I'm assuming that the stressed guy is on the left now, but it's hard to say. I apologize for that. We do know, however, that these are known changes in the immune system, in the hearts, in the cardiovascular system, and in the brain. I'm actually taking a look at this now with a magnifying glass, and I still can't tell. At any rate, we do know that these are ongoing known effects of stress on the heart and other systems. This is a statue to a legendary or mythical figure of a guy named John Henry. And I put it in here because early cardiovascular effects of stress and trauma was originally called John Henryism. So for those of you who do not know who John Henry is, I'll tell you a little bit about that. He was a legendary figure, apparently a very big strapping man. He was African American. He worked on the railroad with the crew whose job it was to, with these very large hammers, to put in the big spikes that hold the rails down. You may have seen a railroad spike. It's like a giant nail. It's quite thick, and it has a little lip on it that holds the bottom of the rail. And then you drive the stake into the ground so that the rail is less likely to pop up, especially as a train goes over it. And you need to put hundreds and hundreds of these spikes in to keep the rails down. It's very hard, tiring work. Now, John was a foreman, and he was told by the boss of the railroad company that they were soon going to replace him and his crew with a new machine. It was a steam-powered machine that would drive these railroad stakes into the ground, and he would no longer need any of the men to do this work. So he supposedly struck a bargain with the railroad company, and he said, look, I think my men, first of all, we need the work, and I think we can do a better job than your machine can. And if I can prove that I can put in these railroad spikes faster than your machine, then will you, spare us and let us continue to do our job? So the railroad company agreed to this bargain, of course, figuring that the steam machine would still outmaneuver and outpower John Henry. So they put this to the test. I think they supposedly did, how fast can you put in 100 spikes, 100 railroad spikes? So John did his very best. And in fact, he did best the machine. He actually put more spikes in more quickly than the machine. And so he was able to save all of the jobs of his crew members. The problem was that when John Henry went home that night, he had a massive heart attack and died. So on that happy note, there's actually even a song about, and probably a poem about this legendary figure. So in about the 1930s or so, many cardiac physicians were noticing that, particularly in African American men, not sure what happened there. So I'm hoping we're still back and still recording. I want to make sure that we're still recording. So give me a minute. Nope. I'm going to probably have to stop sharing, and so I'll be right back, I hope. I just want to make sure that we are still able to, that I'm still recording and we haven't been stopped. We are still recording, which is fabulous. While I'm here, I'm probably also going to see if I can get my pointer working, which is not one of my options right now. So, okay, I'll go back to screen share and finish talking to you about John Henryism. Okay, so here we are. There we go. That's what I was looking for. I'll get a slightly easier to see cursor here. And there we go. So again, cardiac physicians were noticing that African-American men had incredibly high levels of quite damaging heart disease that often shortened their lives by an estimated decade or so. And they realized that it was largely due to the fact that not only was there poverty and very hard work that they were doing, but mostly it seemed to be that this epidemic, essentially, of heart disease was based in the fact that these were people that had to, every day, every moment of the day, practically, were tried to prove their worth, had to prove their worth in the face of a steady onslaught of racism. And so it's an older term, refers to the cardiovascular effects of the trauma and are certainly the prolonged overwhelming stressors of racism. And it was very well documented that it led to heart disease and early death. That is one of the trauma effects of on the body. There are a lot of immunological effects of this, the need to be constantly physiologically adapting to high levels of stress or trauma. Overall, many inflammatory conditions, including autoimmune disorders. In fact, essentially all of these are linked to inflammation of some sort. Inflammation is now considered probably one of the biggest medical things to try to figure out, because it's going to be really useful in helping us combat things like various cancers, autoimmune pain disorders such as fibromyalgia. We also are quite certain that stressors are involved with the onset, at least, of various dementias and neurological diseases, including, by the way, Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. We know for sure that stress is linked with cancers of the colon, breast, and lung. And it's the HPA axis that activates this massive immunological response that is about swelling, and that is initially really useful if you've just got a cut or something minor. But if you're constantly having to deal with stress and trauma, you have chronic inflammation, which affects many, many systems. If you notice here, arthritis is one of them, rheumatoid arthritis, not osteoarthritis. Even Alzheimer's disease is linked with the immunological effects that create inflammation, some of which is going to be due to a trauma or stress response. Again, this is another, it's a figure that shows known immunological effects of inflammation and linking them to various autoimmune diseases, including gluten sensitivity and things that we wouldn't normally necessarily associate with stress or trauma. Some of these are in fact linked directly with environmental factors such as stress, as well as exposure to toxins. And again, these are immunological inflammatory responses to stress or trauma, causing a high number of autoimmune dysfunction. There are some very interesting genetic effects. There's two of them that are well documented. One of them has to do with something called telomeres. Telomeres are little strands, are actually, they're not that little, but they compact themselves. They're strands of protein that are at their ends of all of our chromosomes. When the chromosome divides and then replicates itself, the telomeres stretch out so that as the genes kind of stretch out and replicate, it helps keep the genes aligned and well organized. The end result is that the telomeres allow for fewer copying errors when a cell when a cell divides and all of the chromosomes split and replicate. Now, the problem with stress is that it actually shortens these telomeres. And that means that in the long run, cell division is compromised, particularly the correct copying and replication of a cell, of a chromosome. Now, what we also know, and by the way, these are shortened, not because it necessarily affects the telomere directly, but what it does is it decreases the activity of a particular enzyme that protects and lengthens the telomeres and keeps them in good health. Remember, I was talking earlier about how stress affects homeostasis. This is one of its effects. It reduces the production of an enzyme that's really, really useful to every cell in our body, so that when the cell replicates, all the chromosomes line up properly and you get a correct copy. One of the problems with miscopying our chromosomes is cancer and other disease processes of the body. So we do know that stress decreases the activity of telomerase, an enzyme that protects and actually helps the health of the telomeres. Now, what's really cool is that anything we do to reduce our stress, including active meditation, even medication with a C that reduces our stress, actually raises our levels of telomerase and can help actually correct and repair the length of the telomeres. So all is not lost. But it's very interesting that stress, and you think that stress might make it maybe enhance our ability to replicate our cells so we stay strong and healthy, but it doesn't. It actually inhibits cell health and the correct replication of our chromosomes. Now, another unrepairable change to our genetics is kind of disturbing. There's pretty solid research now, and from many sources. Here's one of the here's a source here from Science magazine, and the drawing that goes with it, about what are known as epigenetic changes. Epigenetic means essentially a genetic change that occurs as a result of exposure to something in our environment. So for instance, you can have epigenetic changes with you exposure to radiation, for instance, or exposure to certain toxins. But guess what? We have discovered, much to our chagrin, that trauma, major trauma like war, famine, genocide, etc., changes some of the genes that we know are responsible for our stress response, including one of the ones I showed you earlier when I was describing the HPA axis. And the bummer about this is that it changes, excuse me, it flips this gene. It changes this gene throughout every cell in our body, including the cells that are responsible for reproduction. It is possible then that both a man and a woman, but certainly it's been definitely verified more frequently in women, that if a woman has been exposed to war, genocide, slavery, etc., it's quite possible that her eggs will be affected, that the genetic changes in her also occur in her eggs. This means that she could, in fact, pass this on to her offspring. There is also growing evidence this also occurs in men, so that even their sperm now carries this new gene that is makes us actually hypersensitive to the effects of stress and trauma, makes us overreactive and overly anxious. This was first shown pretty conclusively in the survivors of the Holocaust. It's now being researched in a wide variety of other populations. And so presumably Native Americans, African Americans that were enslaved generations back, as well as possibly, we may actually be making it worse by ongoing racism, which continues to subject people to extremely high levels of trauma, maybe actually not only changing their own genetic makeup, but allowing these changes to be passed on to future generations. We've traced it also now to at least 3 generations. So from the person to their children and then to their grandchildren. It may be extended past that. So again, we know for sure at least to 3 generations. And the most affected genes are the ones that build our brain and also build the stress-related protein responses. So it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's not just you, it could be you and your offspring. So those are the physiological changes that occur in other parts of the body, and I want to focus now mostly on the brain. The brain has some of its own extremely complicated homeostatic processes that get disrupted by stress and trauma. And one aspect of this, I'm sorry that this is part of the diagram is cut off, but one aspect of this is that we have bottom-up processing, which refers to the fact that essentially the back of our brain, the back of the brain, that includes, I'll include the occipital lobe, which is back in here, the parietal lobe, and a great deal of the back of the temporal lobe. That processes sensory information. Actually, sensory information, both visual and auditory, is processed all the way to the front of the temporal lobe. And we also am going to include in this this bottom-up term is also going to include the subcortex, which runs sort of in here and extends also into at least the inside portion of the temporal lobe, at least to about here. So bottom-up processing refers to sensory information that comes into the brain from various parts of the body. So it involves perceptual networks and subcortical networks. And they're often about homeostasis and instinctive response. A lot of our cognition occurs in here also, the formation of memories, that sort of thing. And when it comes to attention, bottom-up attention-driven processes means that our attention is going to be captured by environmental stimuli or basic instinctual needs that our subcortex tells us about. This part of the brain is developed first and is only later in our lives, well, throughout our lifetime, but really, really very actively in our late childhood and certainly through our teens and early 20s. We have massive development of the frontal part of our head. And one of the things that it does is that it begins to modulate and control and often inhibit the kinds of things that are going on in the back of the brain, or what we'd call the bottom-up processing. This is a basic, fundamental kind of physiological or homeostatic balance of the brain, whereby incoming information or bottom-up information is modulated, controlled, etc., by what we call top-down processes from the frontal lobes, or what we call executive functioning. So top-down executive modulation helps to regulate our actions, on our attention, how we focus our attention. It's involved with solving problems, making plans, and then monitoring how those plans come out. It has involved a lot in emotional regulation. It allows us to rally motivation and cognition and effort to meet our goals. And it involves frontal subcortical circuits, which is why I spent so much time in the last week kind of helping, at least introducing you to this idea of frontal subcortical circuits. So sadly, stress and trauma really, really disrupts frontal subcortical circuits to the point that the normal adult top-down modulation of our emotions, of our behavior, etc., gets disrupted. And there's way too much subcortical and bottom-up activity, which leaves us quite dysregulated and sometimes at the mercy of really disruptive thoughts, emotions, etc. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. So as a reminder, this is our limbic system, and as hopefully you might remember, the basal ganglia also happen to fit right in here underneath all this. But we have this is a see-through brain. So this is the amygdala on the left side, and that's the amygdala on the right side of the brain. It's directly connected to the hippocampus and swings around into this little thing here and swings back around to the other side of the brain. And this thing is called the fornix. The smell nerve is often considered or the olfactory bulb is the same thing as the smell nerve. That kind of, it's processed, the sense of smell is processed here, but there's also things that go right directly to the limbic system from the smell nerve. And that's one of the reasons that smell memories are so powerful. At any rate, the top-down and bottom-up systems intersect right here in these subcortical structures. And both the limbic system and, I said here, especially the limbic system, but it also involves the basal ganglia, particularly the frontal subcortical circuits. They're very heavily intertwined with the GO system of the basal ganglia. But the reason I selected the limbic system is because the limbic system is giving the front part of the brain tons of information about our homeostatic well-being, our emotional well-being, and that sort of information is super important to the frontal lobes, and will sometimes overwhelm the frontal lobes when there's too much emotion, when there's too much innate muscle memory, essentially, that's being fed into the system that tells us that we are in danger, that we have been traumatized. So again, for the bottom up, that involves the back of the brain, the brain stem, and the limbic system. That bottom up information essentially gets to be way too much for the top down modulation to work effectively. That's the bottom line. If you remember nothing else, that's the bottom line of what trauma does to us. This should look familiar. You saw it last week. Frontal subcortical circuits are complex circuits that modulate from the dorsal lateral prefrontal, which, by the way, doesn't quite. This is I hardly ever see an anatomical drawing that's completely accurate in terms of where areas are. The dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex does not necessarily take in the frontal pole. It's more kind of in this area. But that's kind of the cool, logical, rule-based reasoning. Unfortunately, it was given a relatively hot color, but it's the cool, kind of logical, take your time kind of problem-solving system. And here's some of its circuitry through the basal ganglia. That's not as important as the fact that you simply understand that it's got some complex interactions with the subcortex below. We also have here the anterior cingulate. It happens to be in green, a cool color, but it is in fact part of our what we call our hot reasoning system that is really about motivation and giving a great deal of motivation to certain priorities. Unfortunately, with trauma, the priority might be finding safety at any cost, and not necessarily giving motivation and oomph to other important goals in our life. This blue area here and here, and again here on the underside of the brain, look how large that is. It's really a massive part of our frontal lobes, is our orbital frontal cortex. And that's very heavily innervated by the limbic system. And this is the lobe that is most likely, or part of the lobe, excuse me, that is most likely going to be affected by massive amounts of stress and trauma. It happens to be the biggest portion of our frontal lobe, is the orbital frontal cortex. And it's extremely subject to, or vulnerable to disruption as a result of trauma. So we know, and I could provide you with a ton of articles, but I just wanted to keep this simple. There are very well-documented neurological effects of, again, either really, really high levels of prolonged stress or trauma, even one incident of trauma, but particularly repeated incidents of trauma, which often occurs, say, with sexual abuse. The other horrible thing about that is that it often occurs when the person's quite young, maybe even a child, and that actually prevents the brain from developing properly. So what we know is that trauma leads to the complete overactivation of our subcortical systems. That's, again, mostly the limbic system. It leads to dysregulation within the limbic system. Some of this is due to the effects, by the way, of cortisol. Even though cortisol is incredibly useful for releasing sugars and giving us energy, it actually damages cells within the limbic system, particularly the hippocampus. This has a couple of major effects. And the effects that I'm about to describe, by the way, completely fit with all of the known diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And you'll get those criteria along with this PowerPoint as part of your handouts for the week. So the hippocampus has a number of functions, and one of the things it does actually is it can inhibit the amygdala. So let's say you're walking through the woods, the amygdala says, "Oh man, that's a snake." The hippocampus goes, "No, it was just just a couple seconds ago I noticed a stick in that same area. It's not a snake, it's a stick. Just chill." So that's one of the ways the hippocampus can inhibit the amygdala to some degree. The hippocampus, though, is also extremely, it's vital actually for learning and recall. The hippocampus labels information as being important enough to pay attention to and remember. When the hippocampus is damaged, you get disrupted learning, disrupted recall. And when it can no longer inhibit the amygdala, you also get intense hyperactivity of the amygdala to the point where it actually, the amygdala actually gets larger, and the hippocampal cells actually get smaller as a result of cortisol damage. Eventually, if this happens enough, which it can, again, with prolonged stress or high levels of trauma, it leads to the disruption of, and sometimes the disabling, at least temporarily, of our frontal executive modulation over limbic processes. And it produces very poor emotional control, poor behavioral control, lousy decision-making, and essentially all of the symptoms, I said most, but essentially all of the symptoms of PTSD can be accounted for by this disruption between the frontal subcortical feedback loops between especially the orbital frontal system and the limbic system. Recall also that system, the limbic orbital frontal system, is very much responsible for our sense of self and selfhood. And a lot of trauma really disrupts the formation of a nice, solid, secure, consistent sense of self. This is a slide of some cells within the hippocampus, and it has to be either it's probably in a live mouse with a microscope that you can actually put in the head of the mouse or the rat. But with simply 3 days of stress, not even trauma either, 3 days of stress, which leads to high levels of cortisol production, you notice that there's some cells that are no longer on, they're no longer visible. This cell here is completely died, it's gone. And whatever this was, which probably, that might have been a glial cell rather than a neuron. Something weird's happening over here too. It may be, not sure exactly what's happening here, but that's there. If you notice, there's no dendrites or anything healthy looking about it. It's just this kind of blob. But at least within 3 days, we know for sure if we're looking at this one cell here, it's still there. But there's some other changes that I'll point out in a sec. This cell is completely gone. And if you notice, dendrites that may have belonged to this cell at one time are gone. And all of the nice, stretching out of this cell to other cells has really been greatly reduced. All these lines here that were connecting to this cell should still be there, but they're not. So just within 3 days, there's cell death as a result of essentially the toxic effects of cortisol on cells within the hippocampus. This picture looks somewhat like Donald Duck or Homer Simpson, but I like this picture. Sorry, as you can hear, I have a lot of allergies at the moment, and some of the pauses you hear me take is I'm sipping water. That was my water bottle. And I got to swallow a little bit more here. These are crucial parts of the brain that are affected with trauma. And there's this particular picture is from a really interesting study that was done in 2008. There was a really unfortunately very large earthquake. It was an 8.0 earthquake in China. And researchers were allowed to go in and do a variety of studies with the people who had survived, but were still remained homeless. There were like thousands of people. They remained homeless for many months after this earthquake, and it had killed a lot of people. It had destroyed villages. It was just a really awful event. And they, among the many studies that were possible, was the imaging of their brains. Now, this great big yellow thing here that looks like a duck bill is actually the cerebellum, which is the tiny kind of weird looking little mini brain at the back of our brain. And it's mostly involved, as I pointed out in last week's handouts, it mostly is about learning, motoric learning or movement learning. It allows us to very quickly develop motor routines, and it really smooths out our movement and improves our aim and our speed. But it turns out that in order to do that, it also has some ability to predict things. And you have to be able to predict where your body's heading when you're trying to smooth out your movement. So it turns out that it's actually sometimes often involved with learning about how to adapt to change, essentially. So the cerebellum, as it turns out, can pop up in some odd places involved with attention, adaptation, and of course, adaptation to stress. So after taking a look at several MRIs of survivors of this earthquake that allowed themselves to be studied, these were the main areas of the brain that were affected. And if you notice, these are essentially all, with the exception of the cerebellum, which is its own little thing, these are subcortical structures. This little blue hook thing here, that is the hippocampus. Okay, the little black nubbin at the end of it, that is the amygdala. Now, the amygdala happens to be the end point of these two structures, the hippocampus and the caudate nucleus, which goes up into the basal ganglia. It's actually part of both of those structures. And then, in turn, this is the inside of the temporal lobes. This is the insula or insular cortex, which again, you hopefully remember from last week. This is essentially the very active emotional part of our brain, which is the limbic system, its input to the basal ganglia and its input to the temporal lobes. These were some of the areas that were most affected by the stress of the earthquake. Now, possibly even more important than that is that these subcortical structures, which are normally tightly interconnected with the frontal lobes, in particular, well, in this case, let's see here, orbital frontal cortex. This is going to be the insula. This is other parts of the brain. This is the subcortical structures itself, and also this is the dorsolateral frontal cortex, which can definitely downregulate some of the emotional stuff. These networks, within a fairly short period of time, were weakened. There was decreased connectivity between these emotion areas, the frontal lobes, and something called the default network, which we may end up talking about a little bit later. So that just within 25 days of this earthquake, not only is there way too much activity going on in the subcortex, but the cortical systems that normally can downregulate them or modulate them were weakened. There was, as this says here, decreased functional connectivity, meaning that the connections between them that normally allow them to function optimally were no longer as viable. There was limited ability of the cortex to downregulate or modulate the emotional parts of our brain. This not only changes our emotional set points, but this network, including the default network, is really responsible for how we direct our attention. So now, rather than being able to really adaptively respond to environmental stimuli, we're not going to be as good at that. We're not going to be noticing things that might be important. We're not going to be able to, we're not also going to be able to put enough energy and focus into really important goals. Instead, we are likely going to be more driven by stress-related stimuli. We're going to be possibly hypersensitive to stress-related stimuli and not to more functional things that would be more adaptive. So a summary of the neurological effects is that we have less functional ability of the frontal lobes to downregulate the limbic system. We end up being driven by the limbic system so that now we're hyper-aroused, we're hypervigilant. We have something called negative priming, which is we are now essentially hypersensitive to anything that's going to be negative or potentially threatening in our environment. And that's going to drive most of our cognitive processes rather than other more adaptive kinds of goals or processes. We have memory impairment. This is largely due to disruption of hippocampus and how the hippocampus activates memory networks. We have also reduced emotional and behavioral regulation as a result. And these neurocognitive issues essentially account for all of the symptoms of PTSD, which are over here on the right in in purple. A hallmark of PTSD is having abnormal memory. Not just flashbacks and intrusive memories of the trauma, but it actually affects just day-to-day memory. People with PTSD often have spotty, inconsistent memory, inconsistent learning. Sometimes they can't tell you what they had for breakfast, just because the hippocampus is not working as well as it should, because there's a certain layer within it that have diminished cell activity as a result of cortisol damage. As a result of this, some of the problems with learning and memory, it turns out that normally the kinds of things that we use to help people with, say, things like phobias or high levels of anxiety, they don't work as well with people with PTSD. We need to use other approaches with them. And that's because of some abnormal issues around learning and memory. People with PTSD also are remarkable for emotional dysregulation when they're triggered. No surprise. I mean, if you thought that you were back in the traumatic situation and felt unsafe most of the time, you're not going to be very emotionally regulated. It's not possible. It's also not possible when you have lowered functioning of your frontal lobes to have very good emotional regulation. Also, as a result of impairment of the connections with the frontal lobe, is anything that the frontal subcortical systems are good at are going to be impaired. You have impaired executive skills, particularly problems with decision-making, organization, regulating our emotions, initiative and follow-through, the ability to learn from our mistakes, the application of any knowledge that we've acquired, and also, really importantly, some self-awareness and self-monitoring. These tend to be quite impaired, especially if somebody has PTSD and is being stressed out. There's also problems with attention and concentration. including the flexibility and the ability to direct our attention to things that are important. They may be important goals to us based on our cortical functioning, but the subcortex doesn't care. The subcortex is going to be really taken up with trying to stay safe and just trying to maybe just be in survival mode quite a bit of the time. Now, when the sense of being unsafe becomes overwhelming, or the person has flashbacks or a lot of triggers during a particular period of time, the limbic system will kind of slow us down and shut down, so that that constant conversation between the limbic system and the frontal lobes gets disrupted, and it will alter the person's sense of reality to the point where they may be feeling depersonalized, maybe not completely in their body, for instance, or maybe even be completely dissociated. It can be argued essentially that a flashback is in fact a dissociation. You feel as though you are no longer in this time period, but you're back at some traumatic event that you've experienced. People that have dissociative identity disorder, or what we used to call multiple personality disorder, usually have a terrific history of trauma. And this is how they end up splitting and completely dissociating various aspects of themselves to the point where they are actually have whole individuals, whole different personalities that will arise as needed, usually to protect them or to function in the world. So again, all of this constellation of symptoms it can be readily accounted for by disruption of the frontal subcortical, particularly frontal limbic connections. These are essentially some of the common symptoms of PTSD. And again, essentially every single one of them can be accounted for by this particular model of way too much bottom-up activity and not enough top-down or frontal inhibition or modulation of that activity. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do for your assignment is add to the biopsychosocial aspects of understanding of PTSD. This particular PowerPoint talks obviously at length about the physiological or biological aspects. It covers a great deal of the psychological, the cognitive and emotional aspects of PTSD, but it does not necessarily address really important interactions between the environment, especially social connectedness, and PTSD. And I'd like you to fill that in as part of your assignment for the week, or as your assignment for the week. I don't think I'm going to ask you to do anything else. I will clarify that in a handout that helps to remind you what the task is, but I'm going to tell you now that things that are going to be really important are, first of all, the environment produces some kind of event or stimulus that is interpreted by the brain and eventually can create high levels of anxiety and PTSD and trauma, or a trauma response that can eventually result in PTSD. So the first bit is a trigger. There may also be some, so that is a precipitating factor, right? Is that some kind of stressful event? So that's one thing to make sure you cover. The other thing is that when somebody is dysregulated, both physiologically and psychologically, there are definitely going to be social ramifications. It's going to be really hard for somebody to trust people, to be consistent in relationships. One of the issues with PTSD is the person can be hypervigilant, fearful, irritable, and when they're having flashbacks and they're being really triggered, they're not much fun to be around. That in turn causes a vicious cycle of maybe being further stressed by friendships and marriages and other close relationships that are broken. On the other hand, having really good social supports is a protective factor. for the recovery from PTSD. Having really poor original attachments in childhood actually is a predisposing factor for PTSD. So those are the things I want you to discuss. There is definitely some solid research on this, but I do want you to use your imagination as well. And if you think something might be true, might be either a contributing factor or a complicating factor or a predisposing factor, but can't find research for it, go ahead and mention it anyway. Do try to find some research for it, but put it in the chart. I will also ask you to integrate how these external or environmental social forces might also influence both the psychological and physiological aspects of PTSD, so that there's the combined factors, not just the social factors or environmental factors by themselves, but how do they interact with the biological, the psychological, and maybe pull it all together into a three-way biopsychosocial model of how PTSD works in folks. Okay. A summary of these particular set of slides: the need to respond or adapt to chronic or severe stress or a trauma can disrupt or does disrupt self-regulatory systems throughout our body, including the brain. These complicate and prolong the recovery process from a trauma. It contributes to the possibility of either current or future physical illnesses. It definitely messes up the balance of top-down modulation on our bottom-up processes. It accounts for the symptoms of PTSD and, unfortunately, may also be something that we can transmit biologically, genetically to future generations. So those of you who are planning to have kids, marry somebody happy who has not had a family history of trauma. It'll be good for the kids. Now, we also have, and this, by the way, has a little bit to do with your assignment, which is why I stopped and told you about it. Some of the cultural ways of dealing with PTSD actually make it worse. So we do not have a good understanding in general of how varied and numerous the effects of trauma can be. We need to change that. We need to also be careful to mind our physical health, and actually somatic therapies are really helpful for PTSD. We generally do not think of this. Ideally, we also, especially we've been exposed to a lot of trauma, war, sexual assault, any number of traumas, try to lead as relaxing and healthy a lifestyle as possible, and that includes a fair amount of movement and good nutrition. This is definitely a very bad idea. Do not try to tough it out. That's our cultural response frequently to traumas. Oh, shake it off. Oh, get over it. Oh, get some closure. That does not happen easily, partly because we do not understand how incredibly deep and broad the effects of trauma can be on us. We also tend to not take into effect the tremendous number of executive skills that go into PTSD, and we do not include them in our interventions. And in fact, we often criticize people with PTSD for not having very good executive skills instead of helping them with them. Mindfulness practices, which, by the way, decrease bottom-up stress responses and improve top-down modulation, as well as increase our telomerase, are things that people with PTSD should definitely practice, and that people in psychology that deal with people with PTSD should encourage and help them to develop those skills. And really, really importantly is helping people to maintain and develop social networks of support, particularly in people who were predisposed to PTSD because they had early relational trauma, early attachment trauma. They are particularly prone to PTSD, and it really makes it much more difficult for them to have some recovery So social networks are crucial for the recovery of PTSD. And in fact, this is going to be true for any mental illness that we study. And I think the last time, yes. So like the bottom line is this: we try to find a balance between things rather than, as we usually do as in school, is burn the candle at both ends and assume that we're going to be able to maintain our health and our mental health. We're just going to burn out. The idea is to maintain some kind of balance in our life. And that's it for the handout. So this will probably be one of the few times that you get to see me. This is not quite my natural environment, although I wish it was. This is a nice scene from one of the beaches in Laguna. It's a plein air painting from probably the early 1900s, when there was a very large colony of what they call plein air, which means basically out in the fresh air, artists that use the natural landscape and lighting to do their paintings. I happen to be a huge fan of Laguna, and this is one of my happy places. So I wish you luck with your next week's assignment. And I got one more thing to say, and that is several people are kind of stressing out about their final assignment for the course. And essentially, think of it this way. Think of it as a really, that's kind of a pretty thorough lit review. It's not a traditional like experiment. Like, I want to study how, let me think of an example here. Somebody suggested that they wanted to study how stress affected the academic and social performance of college students. Great idea for study. However, probably the smartest things to do, and this is what I advise them, is to simply give me a biopsychosocial model of depression. I think I said stress, either, whatever it was. Let's say they said stress. So biopsychosocial model of stress and how it affected in college students, including how it affected their academic functioning and their social functioning. You don't have to conduct an experiment or propose an experiment. Really, what you have to do is a lit review that looks at biological factors, psychological factors, and environmental or social factors that are relevant to what it is that you're interested in. You then, and the hard work is then in how those, figuring out how those two things, how those three things combine, both in two-way combinations like psychological, and biosocial or biological and environmental, and also psychosocial ways. And then do the three-way combination for sort of a coherent model of whatever it is that you're looking at. You use the charts. You can include them in your final paper, although it's an appendix. It's not part of the pages of your paper. But use the charts to help organize your thought processes. And I will be getting back to the rest. I've gotten back to several of you in the class already about your final topic. And I'll get back to the rest of you by the end of this week. And I hope you have a good one. You take good care. You may see me again later in the semester, but for now, as far as I can tell, this is probably the last time we will have a recording for the lecture. Take good care.